Okay. Hello, Dance 101. So we're starting Ballet Part 2. I hope you all had a chance to look over Ballet Part 1 over the weekend and trying to get a sense of how far ballet has come over the last 500 years. So we started out as folk dancing, which then with the rise of the Renaissance came into the courts, and then Catherine de' Medici then brought it over into France as a show of political power, and she really helped spread the aesthetic of ballet at the time, which was very different than what we know of ballet today, because it was all men in very elaborate costumes with very erect postures and lots of footwork. Then comes to Louis XIV, who then codified ballet and made each of the positions and steps, which we know today, in the French language, because he started the very first dancing school. Excuse me, I have a really bad cold, so I'm gonna take a little drink. Okay, so then now we're moving into the 1700s, which Pierre Nover then kind of delineated ballet. He wrote this whole lecture called, Notes on Ballet or Letters on Ballet, and he said we should take away the masks and make the dancing humans and let them be more expressive to what their character is. So La Fille Malgardée was the first ballet that was created. We watched that at the end of last week's lecture. That was the first ballet that was created that showed people dancing as people and not as mythological sea creatures. So that was a very important step, in which really kind of turned the tables into what we know of ballet today. So we're going into the 1800s, and we had that's where women really became prominent and the pointe shoes were invented. So 1832 was the year the pointe shoes were invented, and it was for Marie Taglioni in the ballet La Sylphide. Her dad invented these shoes for her and put her in a long white dress, and he bent her arms, so it's like a more softer line instead of a straighter line with the arms. It was because she was very willowy, very long-limbed, and he wasn't sure if that was going to be acceptable, so he made her a little softer. I'm going to go ahead and go to the PowerPoint. Here we go. Okay, so we have ballet as we know it today. So it starts out with the Romantic ballet period, which is what we just talked about, with the long white skirts and the softened arms, the very soft posture and port-de-bras, and pointe shoes. And that's when pointe shoes were invented. So in the 1800s, that's a very important part. So oftentimes, the themes of Romantic ballet were searching for the unattainable. So you often dealt with supernatural themes like sylphs and water sprites. My particular favorite is from Giselle, which is about women who are basically, they die and they come back from the grave. So they're all women who have been jaded, left at the altar, or there's been some sort of forsaken love or tragedy or affair, something like this. And so then the women would come back from the grave. That's a very ethereal theme, having these ghostly women coming back from the earth. Sylphs, that was the first ballet, was La Sylphide, which was about this invisible fairy that was only visible to this one man, and that was the ballet that first had pointe shoes on stage. The expressive potential of pointe shoes really made the ballet seem more ethereal, because it was this more uplifted, this floating aspect, with the long white costumes. That was very much part of the Romantic aesthetic. So let's go ahead and take a look at Giselle. I'm gonna show you Act 2, which is where the willies, which I often wonder if that's where we get the term, oh, she gives me the willies, or he gives me the willies. The willies are the ghostly women who have been jaded by love, that die and come back from the grave, and they dance men to death in in the forest. So if a man comes into their forest when they awaken, which is during the night, then they dance him to death. So maybe this is the first feminist ballet. Let's go ahead and take a look. Here's Giselle, Act 2. Hilarion, he is a man who couldn't save Giselle from dying, and she killed herself after finding out her lover was actually engaged to another man. And Hilarion was a peasant boy who was very much in love with Giselle, but couldn't save her from herself. And so he is visiting her grave at night, and the queen of the Willies comes and sees him in the forest and eventually dances him to death. This is a very old ballet, originally done in 1841. So there's the Willies. That's the queen in the middle. These are just little excerpts from Act 2. Now notice all the women on stage in the 1800s. And that hasn't left. Women are very much a part of ballet. This is the queen calling Giselle to come be a part of her tribe of Willies. That's Giselle. There's the soft port de bras. Okay. Oh, this is when they kill Hilarion. They dance him to death. And he says, "Please save me." She says, "No, we're going to dance you to death." how to say you, die. And there he is dying. Okay. So there's the romantic ballet, or a very good, fine example of romantic ballet. Pas de quatre is also another example that shows how the point shoe made the ballet more expressive, and the ballerinas were able to achieve this ideal of floating and weightlessness. In the spirit of being a little bit time sensitive here, if you would like to go look at pas de quatre, this PowerPoint will be posted to the files section of Notebowl, and the YouTubes are embedded, so you may go and check out pas de quatre if you would like. That was a ballet that was for 4 of the prima ballerinas of the time. Very much their status was sort of equivalent to how we see professional athletes in our day and age. So they were very well known, somewhat celebrities. And the funny part is that they didn't like each other at all. And so when you watch the ballet, you can see how they are sort of snubbing one another. And whenever it is restaged, those attitudes and personalities are often tried to match as well. So then we came into classical ballet. So early 1800s through about 1845, 1850 is the romantic ballet period. It's very important because that's when the point shoes were invented. That's where women really took their stage. They became extremely famous throughout Western Europe. And during this time, the Russians really wanted to have a part of this growth in art and fame, and so they imported Marius Petipa. Petipa greatly expanded the role of male dancers at that time. So they were mostly supporting roles with point shoes in the romantic ballet, and when Petipa came in, he really made the male dancers push the boundaries of what was possible on stage. He also pushed the boundaries of what was possible in point shoes. And because he was really working to see what could dancers do in these point shoes, he started doing runs and hops and pirouettes and much more difficult technique in the point shoes. And so he's the one who cut off the tutus, made them shorter, so that the audience was able to see the more difficult point work that he choreographed for the ballerinas. Now, Petipa grew up in a theater family and was actually a dancer himself. Him and his brother Lucius were both dancers. Petipa was not as gifted as a dancer as his brother, and he went to Spain and studied flamenco for quite a while. And you will see in some of his ballets, if any of you have seen the Nutcracker, he has the Spanish dance in the Nutcracker. He also did Don Quixote, which is another Spanish ballet. He did all of these things while he was recruited to be the ballet master in Russia. So just to take a quick look at some of Petipa's work, he's probably the most famous choreographer for the story ballets, such as Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, The Nutcracker, Cinderella. These are all ballets that Don Quixote, as I previously mentioned, these are all ballets that Petipa choreographed. So we'll take a quick look at some of his work. Now, this is the Royal Ballet, but it's not posted by the Royal Ballet, so we are going to take a chance. This is the fairy variations from Sleeping Beauty. Now notice the point work. There she is running on point. And there's the turns. Now this was in the late 1800s when this was choreographed. So the evolution of ballet really speeds up in the 1800s. All right, that's all we're going to watch right now, because I've already shown you some of the Sleeping Beauty variations in your look at ballet before we started the history section. So we're going to move on. Okay, so the Russians, as mentioned earlier, had the greatest respect for the arts. They really wanted to push the boundaries of what was considered ballet. It was during this time that the Russians took hold and made a very strong presence in the dance world, and they still hold that presence today. I'm sure that all of you may have heard or have some connotation of the Russian ballerina or the ballet stars of Moscow, and they are very much still part of pushing ballet and seeing what is possible. The man who did the solo from the Take Me to Church song that I showed to you 3 weeks ago, he is a very famous Russian ballet master. He's 26 years old, and he's already a choreographer for a state ballet theater in Russia. So still, again, pushing the boundaries constantly. What is most interesting is the Russians. So we have Petipa and Lev Ivanov, who were doing Swan Lake together, a very classical ballet technique. Then we had this producer, this sort of entrepreneur. His name was Diaghilev, Sergei Diaghilev. And he was not a dancer, but what he was a visionary. And he gathered all the best dancers and the best artists, worked with several artists and musicians like Igor Stravinsky and up and coming choreographers, and he put them together into what he called the Ballet Russe. So I'm going to go back one. And the Ballet Russe is what they left Russia just as they were closing down Russia and not allowing dancers to come in and out. So they left Russia. They began touring all over Western Europe. They put some very risque things on stage. And in particular, what is most famous about the Ballet Russe was in 1912, The Rite of Spring was produced. Okay, and that was by a man named Vaslav Nijinsky. And he put this very, very risque, and not risque in that they were showing lots of skin or sexuality, but more risque in that people thought they were going to a ballet, and what they saw was this very primitive type dancing that was showing a human sacrifice that was over 30 minutes long, and it was done to sort of a Igor Stravinsky, and he has this loud horn that can be somewhat uncomfortable. Some people don't like the way it sounds, and it produced such a riot that the opera house in France, the police came. It was evacuated. There was a big brawl. People were yelling at the dancers. The dancers couldn't even hear the music. People were fist fighting. It became quite a scene, and it is still very famous riot at the Paris Opera House in 1912. And it makes me think, what today would be so offensive that we would start a fight in a theater? And I don't know. I think that we're pretty calloused into what we see on stage anymore. So we'll take a look at the Rite of Spring and this ballet that caused such a ruckus. You hear the horn, it's very annoying, or can be. So not your typical ballet in any fashion. No point shoes. Costuming is very different. All right. This is a more modern version that was redone at the 100-year celebration. She's being sacrificed. Now, notice in Germany, they don't have as many restrictions on their costuming. Okay, so you get the idea. It was very controversial. It still is controversial. That brings us, into Balanchine. So he worked extensively with Igor Stravinsky, who was the composer of the previous music. He was born in Russia in 1904, and he studied with Diaghilev. They took him, he was a very talented dancer, and Diaghilev saw this talent, and as a young teenager, Diaghilev whisked him away and out of Russia during the time of great strife for artists in particular, and they traveled in Western Europe and into the United States and in South America, and Balanchine hurt his knee and then decided that it was time for him to stop performing. And he went to New York City and he founded a dancing school there, which later turned into the New York City Ballet. So he is an extremely important 20th century most famous choreographer. We watched some of his work. He was known for taking the costumes away. The dancers would often just wear leotards and tights. And like Diaghilev, he liked to push the boundaries of what ballet is and was. So instead of just doing the classical story ballets of fairy tales and whatnot, he would take it into just movement and art and movement for art's sake. Okay, so that brings us to the end, and after Balanchine, we've continued pushing what we see on stage, but we also continue to, let's see here. But we also continue to remake some of these very old ballets, and almost every major company in the country will at some point do a romantic ballet, whether it's Sylphide or Giselle. That often classical ballets are constantly being restaged 150 years later. It's very common to see Swan Lake is still, and Black Swan is not Swan Lake. Okay, so that movie is not really what Swan Lake is. I encourage you to investigate your own versions of Swan Lake, to look it up on YouTube, or even better, I know Phoenix has a fantastic ballet. Go and see a real version someday. But right now we are done. We're going to move into modern dance next week. There is an assignment that's due this week, the end of this week, and it's basically just a reflection on your thoughts about the evolution of ballet, where it started and where we are today. Maybe some of the things that stuck out to you most prominently, maybe something that you're inspired by. It's only 2 pages, double spaced, so it shouldn't be too stressful. You don't need to comment on the videos this week. Just click like, let me know that you've watched it, and that will be your attendance points. And we will move into modern dance. Okay, our choreographer midterm is actually going to be due the first week in April, so that will give you plenty of time. All right, again, if you have any questions, problems, comments, you can meet me in person, you can meet me on the computer, or you can email me. I am just a click away. All right, have a nice week.